You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for hitting that play button. This is another episode of the Dave Bullis Podcast. Before we get to today's episode, I just want to say we're giving away a free book from the actual guest on this week's episode. He just wrote a new book called TV Writing on Demand. So if you want to enter to win this contest, it starts today, which is March the 18th, 2018. It will end next week. So 1 week from today, which I believe is going to be, let me look it up. It's the 25th. So March the 25th. So it would be 1 week, noon Eastern to noon Eastern. And here's how to enter. If you just share this episode, whether it be on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, whatever, and also comment in the, whether it be on Podbean or Facebook, just comment below what you've learned from this episode, or hell, if you want to do them both at the same time, that's fine as well. Like sort of do like a retweet on Twitter, for instance, where you can, write something in there and then retweet it. So if you want to, whichever combination, but if you do those two things, you'll be entered in to the competition. If you live in North America, and you're the winner, you will have a choice between a hardback edition or a PDF. If you're outside of North America, the winner would get a PDF copy. So again, very simple rules, but if you want a review of the rules, it's just go to davebullis.com. All of the show notes are there. All the stuff we talk about is there, as always. So whether you're listening in your car or at the gym or whatever, make a note to go there when you go home. And I don't know why you're listening to me while you work out, but please keep doing it. I mean, maybe my voice motivates you in some weird, odd way. But on to this week's episode. My next guest is an award-winning screenwriter, producer, author, and professor. He actually co-wrote the cult comedy Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, starring Christina Applegate, which I always say is a rite of passage for kids of the 80s and 90s, because I think we've all been there one way or the other, where the babysitter dies and we got to hide the body. You know what I'm talking about. But he's also written for Doogie Howser, The Secret World of Alex Mack, MTV. He's also produced a ton of different stuff. And he currently runs the MFA in Writing television program at UCLA for their theater, film, and TV department. And now he's also written this book. He's also written 4 other books, for instance, like 101 Things I Learned in Film School, The Screenwriter's Roadmap. So his latest book is called TV Writing on Demand, which is what the contest is about. And it's all just about the medium of TV, how popular TV is becoming, all the different programs out there. It's a pretty interesting book. I actually got an advanced copy of it. It's a really, really interesting read. And what we talk about in this episode is what I keep telling people when they ask for screenwriting advice. I go, everybody wants to see you have a TV pilot of some kind, because that's where all the money is right now, and that's where all the hits are right now. TV is definitely it. It's the most popular it's ever been. It's the golden age, but it's also very diversified because there's so many different mediums that this episodic format is coming to, whether it be YouTube, Hulu, Netflix, whatever. So just keep that in mind. And again, to enter the contest, just go to davebullis.com and you'll see everything right there. So without further ado, this is episode 209 with guest Neil Landau.
You're listening to the Dave Bullis Podcast.
Well, I kind of started off as writing plays. It actually starts with a lot of what all of my books are about, and character development is about, builds from empathy. So, and filling emotional voids. So much of what characters go through and what we see even in comedies are characters who have voids in their lives and deficits and things, and the course of the story fills those voids. So my father died when I was 6 years old of a heart attack. He was playing basketball with some friends. He collapsed on the basketball court. He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital of a heart attack. And so from that age forward, I had this very rich fantasy life that I was always writing little scenes and plays and wanting to disappear into another world just to kind of, ease my loss of my father. So I was writing plays from the time I was in 4th grade. I started writing little plays and skits and then performing them. And I actually thought I wanted to become a playwright, probably at the time, just because I shared the name with Neil Simon, who was the most, well-known playwright at the time, and I loved his work. And so I thought I would write plays and be like Neil Simon. I didn't think, well, he already existed and I have to create my own voice. I just thought I'll just copy him and, be the next famous Neil playwright. But being raised by a single mom, we always had financial problems. And so I started to think, well, it's very difficult to make a living as a playwright. And I knew what it was like to grow up, financially disadvantaged. So I started to think about, and I knew some people who had gone to film school and who had written movies and for television. And I did know if you can succeed, which of course is a big if, that you can actually not only make a living wage, but you can actually make a lot of money, which would give me security. And so I segued from writing plays I went to UCLA Film School and started writing screenplays. And at the time, one of my best friends growing up, Tara Eisen, who was 1 year behind me at UCLA, but we went to actually elementary school, junior high, which is now middle school, high school, and UCLA together. So we were best friends for a really long time. We decided to partner up and write scripts together because I thought she was the smartest, most talented person I knew, and she felt similarly toward me. So we wrote a few screenplays while we were going to school, and 1 year after I graduated, we kept writing. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we'd write, and Sunday afternoon, we'd write all day. And the first couple we just stuck in a drawer. They weren't very good. The third one became Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead. And we thought we'd be lucky just, to have anybody ever notice us. But that script, actually, there was a bidding war at 3 studios, and it was one of those, big spec script sales from the 80s, 1987, where our lives just changed dramatically because I went from making $18,000 a year to making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And then we were kind of off and running. And that's kind of how it all started, just from, escaping life, a rich fantasy life, and then just dabbling and thinking maybe we can actually do this as a career. And that was the first thing. And once you sell an original spec script or original pilot, that really creates so much heat and buzz that you can actually build a career on that if you can deliver again, after that, if it wasn't just a fluke. So that was kind of my inspiration and how it all started. And with Don't Tell Mom, one of the things Tara and I both had in common is we both were raised essentially from broken families, and her father didn't die, but she was mainly raised by a single mother. We also both looked extremely young for our ages at the time, and people always used to ask if our agent had to give us a ride to the meeting because they didn't believe we had our driver's licenses yet and things like that. So we liked also the idea of playing with age, and we wrote one script about a narc in a high school who was much older and posing as a high school student. And then with Don't Tell Mom, we thought of the idea of somebody who actually could look older, who could go into the adult world and pretend to be an adult. So that was also part of the kind of a theme that we were exploring. And that's kind of how that's how our career really got started.
So when you were writing, Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, since it basically launched your career, when you were writing this,
mm-hmm.
did you actually, were you, when you were writing it, or maybe when you were finished, did you actually say, you know what, I think this is, a home run shot. I think this is, you know what I mean? Like, I think this is going to be it.
Yes. We would jokingly say that. One of the things that is so different between me and Tara is I tend to be very optimistic about everything and pragmatic, and Tara tends to be more cynical. And so I think she always thought, well, who knows, we may never get anywhere. But I felt the thing about Don't Tell Mom that was different was that we had so much fun writing it. There were so many times writing it where we would just, be laughing hysterically. And we would say, we don't know if this is any good, but we think it's funny. We're having a lot of fun writing it. Actually, this is actually an even better part of the story. So at the time, I was always also interested in writing for television. So I did my internship at MPM Enterprises, which was Mary Tyler Moore and Grant Tinker's company. And a show that I just loved so much, which really influenced everything in television and in my life, was Hill Street Blues. And that was the show that I interned on the most. And, I was on set and I would watch dailies and I would get to see all the revisions. And it was just a great experience just to observe and be around that show. But one of the other things I did in my internship was I delivered mail around the CBS lot. This was CBS Redford, which is in Studio City, right near where I live now, actually. And I would deliver mail on a little bicycle. One of the people I delivered mail to was Beth Uffner, who at the time was Senior Vice President of Comedy Development. And she graciously agreed to read a script. And she ended up leaving MTM and becoming a literary agent. And she joined at the time, there was a very big literary agency called Broder, Curl and Webb Uffner, which no longer exists. I think they were absorbed by either ICM or, I don't remember. They were definitely bought out. Beth ended up leaving. But the point of the story is Beth took us on as an agent, and we were hip pocket clients, meaning, for those of you who don't know, that she didn't sign us, but she said, I have interest in you. You guys are young and talented, and I like what I'm reading so far. So let me send your stuff, or let me just informally represent you and see, if we can get anywhere. She was mainly representing sitcom writers. So at the time, everybody was writing spec episodes of TV shows. That's how you got staffed. People weren't really reading original pilots. So Tara and I wrote a spec for the Golden Girls, and we thought it was great. We got it to Beth, and she said she was too busy to handle us anymore, was the bad news. But the good news is she had taken on an associate who would handle us, more of a junior agent, and that they were going to represent us. So this new, younger junior agent who came in, she said, well, what else do you have? Because she didn't really like the Golden Girls. And we had just finished the Don't Tell Mom script, which at the time was called The Real World. That was the original title. And so we got her the script, and she hated it. She hated it so much that she said, I think this is the kind of script you should just put away and never show anyone, because it will actually harm your careers. She said, you don't want this to be, representative of your work. So what we did, because we're writers and neurotic, and we believed her. So I put the script away. It was a printed out script. So, it wasn't even on a computer. Back then we were using early versions of computers, but mostly we were still typing our scripts. I put it under a pair of shoes in my closet, and we stopped missing our writing hours, and we were just very discouraged. But one of my friends from UCLA is a guy named David Koepp, who has become a huge, huge screenwriter. He wrote the original Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire, and he wrote Jurassic Park 1 and 2, and Panic Room, and War of the Worlds, and, on and on and on. I mean, he's become probably the most successful screenwriter, certainly financially in terms of box office, I think, ever. He was over at my apartment, and he was asking about that script, and he said, whatever happened with that script? And I said, oh, it's terrible. We just put it away. And he said, well, how do you know it's terrible? And I said, well, because this agent told us it was terrible and not to show it to anybody. So he asked if he could read it. And I said, no, because, it'll humiliate me. And he said, just let me read it. I'm your friend. I'm not going to, I'll just give you notes, whatever. Anyway, he read it, and he loved it. And he said, it's not the greatest script in the world, but I think you can sell it, and I think it's really funny, and I think the agent's wrong. So based on that, and at this point, David was still nobody, but, I thought, well, maybe we should try to listen to somebody else. The timing was such that one of my UCLA professors had met an agent at a party who was looking for new writers. And my professor said, well, I read a script that I think's funny, and I know these young writers. And so we got the script to him on a Friday. Normally at that time, it would take anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months for an agent to ever get back to you. Got it 2 days later, he called and said, when can you come in? And we went into a conference room, and it was all the agents and partners, and they wanted to sign us. And then they sent the script out, and there was a bidding war. So moral of the story, don't ever listen to one person's opinion. Very important point. And that script really unlocked everything for us, including segueing into writing for television, because Stephen Bochco was producing Doogie Howser, MD at the time, and read the script and also really loved it. And that was how we got our first TV job. So, you never know, it's like William Goldman says in Adventures in the Screen Trade, nobody knows anything. It's always worth getting multiple opinions. And if, 3 people say, this is terrible, I'm just not connecting to anything in the script, then maybe you listen. But one person is never, I don't think is ever necessarily the be-all, end-all of anything. And so that was also part of that story. And I think we thought it was really good, then we were disappointed, and then all of a sudden we thought it was good again because somebody validated us, and it's always hard when you're writing a script to know if it's good because you're too close to it, and I tell my students now at UCLA where I teach now, the first thing you lose once you start writing is objectivity, and it's really hard to see clearly really anything because the characters are starting to kind of lead you around, and you lose sense of the big picture. And it often takes a fresh set of eyes to really, really determine the quality of anything at that point, unless the writer is able to put the script away for at least a few weeks and come back to it with fresh eyes.
Yeah, very, very true. Because I've been there too, Neil, where you're writing a script, and that inner voice inside of you starts kind of saying, come on, this is too much like, The Godfather or whatever. And then you start writing a little more, and you're like, I don't know, what the hell am I doing? And then by the end, you're like, this is all awful. What the hell am I doing with my life? I need to go out and just start a new hobby.
Yes. Well, I always just tell our students now, when I'm mentoring so much more, that voice, that little devil or on your shoulder that tells you suck and that, makes you doubt everything. That's never going anywhere. That's always going to be sitting on one shoulder. The other shoulder, though, hopefully will have your muse, which will counter everything the negative voice is saying. It's almost like there's always a battle between the muse and the furies. And I think, it's the negative voice does have value in that it's ego-driven and it taps into all of your insecurities and doubts and fears and neuroses, but it is also forcing you to be more critical and to, be really tough on yourself because it's probably going to say meaner things and harsher things than anybody in the business possibly could ever say to you. I'd rather hear it from my own inner demons than from an external one who could potentially destroy, my career or, it could hurt my reputation. The challenge is it's almost impossible to be the creator and the critic at the same time, so what I try to do the best of my ability is say, all right, I know the negative, destructive, or hypercritical voice is going to be coming through one side of my head or sitting on one of my shoulders. It's there. I acknowledge it. I just say, just let me finish. I'm going to listen just to the positive muse that's kind of inspiring me. When I'm done, I'll be hypercritical and I'll shift over to my critical mind. But it's really hard to be the creator and the critic simultaneously. It's they kind of cancel each other out, and it's what can cause writer's block. Writer's block is caused by perfectionism, where you just don't want to write anything because you're convinced it's not brilliant. And it's probably because that negative voice is telling you it's not good enough. And then you keep stopping instead of actually getting pages written. So I always tell people the the antidote to writer's block is very simple. Lower your standards. Just write a shitty first draft, and then once it's finished, go back and make it better. And or give it to a few people, trusted advisors, to give you fresh perspectives. Hopefully they'll all agree, but they may not. And then go back. It's the cliche, the adage, writing is rewriting, is absolutely true. You don't, and the growth between that shitty first draft, which is almost always shitty, and that next draft is often the biggest leap a script takes. From that first one that's just an exploratory draft and you're just trying to get it down on the page, to that next one where you're like, okay, now I kind of see what it is or what it could be. And then hopefully, each draft you get closer and closer to, realizing what it could be. And sometimes it surprises you and it's even better than what you originally thought. And then once you please yourself and you please your reps and you get a general consensus that, this is one of your best pieces of work, or this at least could sell and be commercial. Then of course you get notes from the studio and you get notes from the director and the actors, and it's more rewriting and more people to please. And it doesn't really ever end until really the movie's locked. Even in post-production, you can still continue to make changes. In ADR, you can add lines, and it's a very fluid and efficient process that's very expensive, and time is money, and everybody's making discoveries throughout the whole process. But of course, it starts with the blank page and nothing, and I think that's where the writer tends to suffer the most.
Yeah, it's kind of like Robert McKee says, the nothing moves until the writer actually writes, meaning that, without a script, you actually can't shoot anything. But I really like what you said there, Neil, about lowering your standards. It's kind of like dating, you know what I mean? I think everyone, wants to date a supermodel, but, maybe that's not really what's going to happen, right?
Well, yes, I have friends, who have been single for a long time, and I'll say, how's your love life? They'll say, there's no one out there. There's just no one. And I always think, well, there are people out there. You may not, maybe they're not in the prettiest package or something that fits what you think is, your high standard. But there are a lot of wonderful people out there. And if you are a bit more open to it, you'll probably, when you're ready, you will meet somebody. But it's true. I mean, sometimes people, like my brother, when he met his wife, he was convinced she was not right just physically, but the more he got to know her and talking to her, the more beautiful she became. And, they've been married for a long time. So he wasn't so much lowering his standards as maybe just being open to, not everything, single thing has to be perfect, in the first moment, there's a discovery process. So even if you bring in, at UCLA, sometimes people will bring in pages and say, these are terrible pages, but I just needed to write something this week. And sometimes the pages are really good and they didn't even realize it. Or other times, maybe the pages don't work, but there's like one gem buried in those pages that unlocks everything that's going to make the script great. So, you kind of always have to be open to the happy accident that can happen. And that only really happens if you get your butt in the chair and you're willing to face that blank page, or just reattack the scene that seems flat, or the character that's just not speaking to you. And, it takes a lot of courage to write and a lot of patience, just to hope for inspiration. And when it's not there, you have to write anyway. That's, if you're on a deadline, you cannot always wait for inspiration to strike. And that's the toughest thing, because we all want to dazzle everybody every time, but it doesn't really work that way. A lot of trial and error.
Yeah, and you touched on this too, like previously, like writing should be fun, like when you're sitting down and you're writing something, especially like a comedy, because I've had friends who, and it's happened to me as well, where, they're trying to write a movie, a horror, comedy, whatever, and they just kind of agonize and overthink the whole thing to the point where they're like, no, sort of everything. It's like, I don't know if you ever read the Art of War.
Sure,
The War of
absolutely.
Art. I'm sorry, The War of Art by Stephen
The War of
Pressfield.
Art.
Yeah, by
Yeah.
Stephen Pressfield. It's like that resistance comes in that form where you overthink everything, you overanalyze
Yes.
everything, and then everything stops becoming fun, and it becomes just this miserable slowdown where everything, you know what I mean? Where everything's like, all right, I
Yes.
guess I'll write a word or whatever, a sentence, paragraph, but
Hmm.
everything just becomes this like arduous process, and you're like, I don't know if I want to write today, and then tomorrow, and then a week, and then all of a sudden, a year's flown by and you haven't written anything.
Yeah. I mean, that's one, there are people who say, don't go to film school. You can just read scripts and watch movies, or you can, study television by reading pilots and watching shows. And I think those things are true. But the thing that a program does, or just a really good writers group does, is it makes you accountable, and you actually just have to bring something in every week. You have deadlines. And in some cases, the difference between a free writers group, just with talented writers and friends getting together once a week, like a book club, to really just workshop their pages. What some people have said, those don't work. People end up flaking. I mean, of course, many of them do work, but the ones that don't work are because people kind of just are dabbling, and it does become sort of a hobby. Whereas if you're in a program and you're paying money and going into debt, as horrible as that is, because it's pretty horrible to owe money, to graduate in an artistic field with no guarantee of success and debt. But our students, are very aware of that. And so they work their butts off, and they are very aware that, that this is an investment in their future, and they do take it very, very, very seriously. And they just don't, they don't have a choice. So it's like, well, at this point, you're running out of time, so just go with the best idea you have and get a draft in. You can always rewrite it later. And so I think time and deadlines are just the best gift for any writer, because it gives you structure, and, a deadline is a gift. I always say a writer without a deadline just cleans things. You'll have the cleanest, you'll find every possible excuse not to write. Having a writing partner really helps with that. It's really helped me and Tara tremendously early in our careers, because if one person didn't feel like writing, the other person would be the disciplinarian and say, no, we have to focus. There were times that both of us didn't want to write, and we'd just go to the movies or, go do something else. Or we would challenge ourselves if we really, really didn't feel like writing and we had a few extra days. We would just do things like go to the mall, but we would give ourselves an assignment, like we have to go to stores and find clothes that our characters would wear, or observe people in the mall to help us find, an interesting look, or eavesdrop on a conversation to, get inspiration for dialogue. So it was always like everything we did would still feed the creative process. It's not it doesn't substitute sitting down and facing the page, but it does kind of go, all right, well, we're still kind of working. And maybe while we're out talking or just having lunch or trying to avoid writing, invariably, if you have a partner, you'll start talking about the script, and suddenly you're in a story session, and suddenly you're jotting down notes, and you push through, something that maybe you would have not been able to do on your own. So it also really helps with comedy, because if we're laughing, at least we think it's funny. Or if one person pitches a joke or a funny situation and the other person laughs, that's a good barometer. It's very hard to write in a vacuum, and that's another thing that gets people kind of stuck. I know with Don't Tell Mom, it's just such a vivid memory. When we decided that we had to get rid of the dead babysitter's body, we wanted to just. I remember that we were sitting in my mom's house at her kitchen table, and we said, "What if they put it in the trunk? Like if she came with a trunk of all of her stuff, and what if they drop it off at the mortuary? Because they don't want to bury the body. They're not criminals. So we thought we'll just do the right thing. We'll drop it off in a mortuary. They'll give her, they'll figure out what to do. But then they had to leave a note. And when we wrote the note that they were going to put on the trunk, which said, "Nice old lady inside, died of natural causes," we just thought that was the funniest thing in the world. We laughed for like 15 minutes thinking that was hilarious. We didn't know if anybody else would think it was hilarious, but we did. And that and the ending of the script, which was after the babysitter dies, early on in the first act, we wanted to then have the audience forget that the babysitter even existed, because I think the reason the script sold was the ending, which was after this whole ordeal of everything that they've all been through. The mother comes back into town, and it looks like, kind of in that Risky Business way, which was another inspiration for us, really great teen comedy, much better than Don't Tell Mom the Babysitters did. But at the end of Risky Business, it looks like he got away with everything. And we wanted to have that. But then when we outlined the movie onto index cards, which was how I still outline, we thought, what if the mother comes back, it looks like she got away with everything, and then the mother says, "Oh, one more thing, where's the babysitter?" And that would be the first time the audience even heard about the babysitter for over an hour. I think that ending really helped us sell the script because it was surprising, and the reader forgot about the babysitter also. And, having a really strong start and a strong finish really helps, sell scripts. And those two things never changed. Those were like locked, and no matter how many drafts we did, they stayed, those were never, nobody touched those. There was pressure from the studio to have a police investigation, people looking for the babysitter, and they wanted us to constantly, remind the audience about the babysitter. And that was something we kept fighting against, saying that's going to ruin the ending. And we struck some kind of a compromise. The weird thing about the movie is, as you kind of mentioned it, when it came out, it did okay. It was low budget, so it's made money. It definitely made money, but it's become more and more popular over time. And it's now kind of like a cult movie, which we don't really understand exactly why or how it happened. But even this coming Monday night in LA, there's a tribute screening to it. As part of the UCLA archive, they're screening a series called Working Women. And one of the movies they're screening is Working Girl, which was happening around the same time as Don't Tell Mom was first sold. And Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead. They're including that in the series. And so, Monday night, there's going to be hundreds of people watching the movie and Q&A. And we just think the whole thing's hilarious because it's been, so many years since the movie came out. But there's still just a ton of interest in it. And people still quote lines of dialogue from it to me when I go to parties. And I love it. It's hilarious that it turned into this, but that we never expected.
Yeah, it's like there was a piece of advice I once heard that for when you're submitting a script to like a gatekeeper, so to speak, the most important part, the what matters most is the first 10 pages, and then when it's an actual movie, the most important part is the last 10 minutes.
Yes, yeah. I mean, if you look at Get Out, which was, I think, should have won the Oscar for Best Picture. I'm glad it won for Best Screenplay, but I just never knew where that movie was going. And I know that they, reworked the ending several times, but very memorable ending. And yes, I think the reason I think that's true about, the last 10 pages is that you need to somehow have an inevitable ending that the audience should have seen coming but didn't. This is just my opinion, and it has to be surprising. I think there's a reason why the 80s romantic comedy has kind of gone out of style, and a lot of that is just it was so formulaic that the audience was so far ahead of the story that the only fun was how they were going to get together, but there was never a question that they would get together at the end, And so we really wanted, to go against formula, and a lot of, it wasn't so much conscious, like we're going to go against formula, but we knew we needed something that was unexpected. And even my favorite romantic comedy of all time is The Philadelphia Story with Katharine Hepburn, and Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant. what I love about that movie is there are 4 potential suitors, well, 3 really, and then it narrows down to 2. But you really don't know at the end which guy she's going to marry until the ceremony is about to start. And I love that, and all the options are viable. I also really like the anti-romantic comedy, My Best Friend's Wedding, with Julia Roberts, because she doesn't end up with the guy. And you're thinking she's going to. And then when, it ends in an unexpected way. And I always appreciate that. And I love O. Henry endings like Fight Club or The Sixth Sense, and, movies where everything shifts and you didn't see it coming until that moment. And then you go, oh, that's great. Why didn't I see that? And it's so satisfying. Those are always my favorite kind of movie experiences.
There was a great 80s teen comedy that was kind of like about, guys going after the girl, called The Last American Virgin. Have you ever seen it?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
That ending, let me tell you, nobody nowadays, if you said I wanted to do that ending, you wouldn't be able to get away with it because it's such a downer ending, and it ends a lot like real life. And then if you compare that to like maybe Money Can't Buy Me Love or something like that, okay, we know they're going to get together. But how they got together. By the way, I like both of those movies. It's just when I saw The Last American Virgin, and like, or even movies like Better Off Dead. I mean, stuff like that. It's just absolutely fantastic. I mean, and the how quirky that one was. But I'm sorry, I know I'm kind of jumping around here. But Last American Virgin,
that's
though.
Okay.
Last American Virgin. I mean, that ending. I tell you what, Neil, would you mind if I spoiled it for everybody? If I just told them what the ending is?
No.
Okay.
Not at all.
So everybody, if you don't want to, just jump ahead like 30 seconds if you don't want me to spoil this for you. But essentially, this guy, the whole movie is going after this girl. She gets pregnant by another guy. This is like the third act, and he sells all his stuff, like his stereo system, everything else, to help pay for the abortion. She gets the abortion. And later on that night, they're or maybe a week later at a house party, and she's with the guy who basically left her, and she's forgotten all about the protagonist after all he's done for her. And it just ends with him crying to himself in his car as he just drives into the night, and the movie ends. And I remember, Neil, I was floored by that ending because I was like, holy shit.
Yeah. Well, I think it's always often I'll say to students, whether it's a TV pilot or a movie, I'll say, pitch the first half of the movie, just the broad strokes of what you're planning, in the early stages, and then just ask somebody, what do you think is going to happen? And if they just go immediately to your ending and they're like, this, because this is the most logical, obvious way that it would end, if they're right, you have to change the ending, or you have to change the path to that ending, because you want, that's the definition of anticlimactic, right? Where it's like everything happens exactly the way you thought. So even a movie like, When Harry Met Sally, which is a great romantic comedy, you kind of know they're going to get together, but Nora Ephron, she pushes it to the last minutes on New Year's Eve. And then when they do get together, the last lines of the movie are, I hate you, Harry, I really hate you. Not, I love you, Harry, I really love you, and I also appreciate that, where it just seems impossible that it could happen. Like The Graduate, he gets there to stop the wedding, and then it's too late. Mike Nichols is one of my favorite directors, and I love The Graduate, one of my favorite movies. But, great climax. Benjamin rushes to the church, he finally gets there, he's screaming, Elaine, and then it's too late, it's over, but it's not over. And then you get that that incredibly iconic ending when they go on the bus and the Sound of Silence plays, and the movie ends with them going, all right, we actually pulled this off, she's the runaway bride, they are together, and yet now what? Now what the hell do we do? That was also, people remember these endings because they're indelible, and they're risky because they're not just they lived happily ever after. And I feel like maybe it's a good segue to talking about television. Part of why I think TV is where the most exciting storytelling is happening now, just exactly for that reason, which is it's not just happily ever after. It's this ongoing, long-term relationship with these characters where we align with them by the end of the pilot, but then it's this fluid dance of allegiance, and sometimes we approve of what they do and sometimes we don't. And it doesn't really end until the end of the series, which might be, 5, 6, 7, or, Grey's Anatomy, I think, is going into season 14. It's just constantly ongoing. And as long as it keeps surprising us and the characters keep facing new problems and new challenges, it remains interesting. So it's against ever really having to fully end a story. I love how highly serialized television is now, and how great writers and really strong, effective writers' rooms constantly find ways to surprise us and to pivot from what we thought was either the end of a story, where it has, I write about this in the new book, I call it story tentacles, where you make story choices that lead to more story, because it has to continue and evolve. And movies now start to seem very finite to me, like even really good movies. I'll think, that's it? I want more. I want to spend more time with these characters. And I think with, the domination of, and people shifting over to on-demand viewership, where they can binge view and they can watch things when they want to, and how they want to and where they want to, that we love these ongoing stories that just keep pulling us in different directions and challenge us and the characters. And so you have to think about where you want to land at the end of the pilot, at the end of the season, but it's an ongoing story. And one of the things I talk about is how, a movie is designed to have a beginning, middle, and end. A pilot is designed to have a beginning, middle, and an open end. And you want to end on more questions than answers, and you want to leave everything wide open for more story. And, writing movies, it was always, what's the ending? How does it end? How does it complete? And this is the exact opposite of that.
Yeah, when I was working with Jennifer Grassani, because I actually shot a TV. Jen. I think everyone knows Jen. I actually shot a TV pilot a couple years ago. I actually produced it, wrote it, directed it. It's online right now, by the way. It's called Game Over, and it's just, it was like I aimed high. We had so many opportunities. There was a lot of backstage fighting. You know what I mean? There's a lot of behind the stuff that was behind the scenes, as I'm sure you know what I mean. Like a lot of, I eventually got it pushed out. I finally decided to upload it last year, because I was just sitting on it. I was like, it's doing nobody any good by just sitting on this damn thing. So, but after working with Jen, I realized, have that pilot, and then the pilot has to ignite the series. So then when you go to pitch it, you have sort of like, what's the pilot arc, what's season 1, and what's going to be the series arc. So, we're eventually, like Walter White, Breaking Bad is the best example. Walter White, he goes from this mild-mannered man in the middle of New Mexico to a drug kingpin. Well, how does that transformation happen? Well,
Mr. Chips into Scarface was what Vince Gilligan said.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And you sort of have, how does that journey occur, and what happens during those moments. It's so much more of an art than a science. That's why when everyone tries to, like, you know what I mean? Like I sometimes see, when like people, when they try to dissect certain things, they almost like go, well, on page 17, this beat has to happen. On page 30, this thing has to happen. You're kind of like, oh, come on, let's just move away from, you know what I mean? Like that's it. That's too sciencey.
I agree completely. Yeah. I mean, I'm so against formula now. There are certain things that, there's, very few absolutes, in screenwriting, and I always tell people, if somebody tells you there's a formula or a template to follow, it's not a bad idea just to look and say, okay, well, you could break down a lot of movies that follow that formula successfully, and that is valid, but there are so many different structures and ways to tell stories. And particularly now, if you can innovate and you can break form, and the story still works, all the better, because it's a mysterious process. But there are a few absolutes that I think are valid pretty much across the board and across genres. One of them is, I believe every story is a suspense story, whether it's a comedy or a horror or a thriller or a drama. And the reason is that, the two key ingredients to suspense are anticipation and surprise. Well, every story needs to fill the audience with anticipation of what's going to happen next. And hopefully when you get there, it's surprising. So I'm always going, where's the suspense? There's no dramatic tension. If the script's not working, why isn't it working? Well, there's no dramatic tension. Why isn't there any dramatic tension? Usually that goes back to empathy, which is the first thing I started to talk about, which is, you get that note, which is the most frustrating note to get from an executive or a rep, which is, I didn't really connect to anybody. Or a development person who might say, why should I care about any of these people? And suspense only works when you're worried about what's going to happen. You have to connect to the characters. So, Breaking Bad's a great example because, by design, Walter White is an underdog from the very beginning. And we're worried because he's dying. And he has a wife and he has kids and he's struggling. And so, you really align with him becoming an anti-hero because it seems like the best option based on limited options that he has. I have a thing in the new book, a quote from David Mamet, where he talks about great drama is choosing not between right and wrong, but between two wrongs. It's because Walter White, neither option is good. If he doesn't become a drug dealer, he's probably going to die and leave his family unprovided for, and he's going to feel like a failure. He sees this as drawing upon a skill set, something that he has that's fairly valuable. And when he connects with, his former student, with Jesse Pinkman, he sees this as a great opportunity that could solve a problem. But he's caught between two wrongs because while it might solve one problem, it could also, get him killed or thrown into prison. And so Chapter 8 in TV Writing on Demand, the new book, I have a quote from David Mamet. It says, "A moral decision is not the choice between wrong and right. That's easy, but between two wrongs." And if you look at some of the best shows, and I have a lot of examples based on that quote in the book, whenever you can have a character caught between a rock and a hard place, you're always going to generate more suspense and probably empathy because, we can all relate to not having ideal choices in front of us, and yet, which is the lesser of the two devils. And human nature is to take the path of least resistance. So if there is a path of least resistance, that's clearly the easier, better path. And the writer in the character doesn't take that path, you're not going to root for them because you're going to think, well, why did they not go down the path that was clearly the smarter, easier choice? But if you remove choice and you trap them in a situation where, neither alternative is ideal, I just feel like right away you have tension that you wouldn't, normally have. Another absolute for me is I believe that every story is a coming-of-age story, no matter what the ages of the characters are. It's a maturation story, and they somehow need to learn something or discover something. And I think that all movies and TV shows are about characters who have to grow up and or overcome something that an emotional void or deficit that they've never really dealt with, and that's part of the journey of the story. So I always want to look for growth or evolution in a character. The exception being multi-camera sitcoms, where the characters tend not to change by design, and we don't really want them to change because we like them stuck in their problems. But movies and one-hour dramas and half-hour dramedies tend to have characters at least trying to change their circumstances. And every episode there's the potential to win or lose something. And I think that positive and negative tension generates heat, dramatic intensity, and helps with suspense. So, for me, those two things I always go back to. I want there to be a cathartic experience where characters have to face fears and either overcome them, or if it's a tragedy, they won't overcome them. But they had the potential to overcome them. You know, Walt could have turned himself in ultimately, or changed his ways. You know, but once he became Heisenberg, he couldn't. You know, he just became completely hooked on that power, and at that, you know, it's a very lonely ending for him. You know. I don't want to. I'm sure most people know how it ends, but anyway, you get the idea.
Yeah, I think I pretty much everyone who's probably listening to this podcast has seen the end of Breaking Bad, but it's a fitting end for him. So. Yeah, it's a fitting end for him, and it kind of ties in with the pilot episode, which is very important. Not only the whole obviously the whole series, but just that pilot, because what he's talking about in the pilot about chemistry and how things change. It's transformation, right? Which is what the characters do. So, you know, just you know, transforming themselves, their perceptions. You know, like David Mamet was talking about those two dilemmas. You know, the dilemma of two bad options. You know, and that's something true you said too. Is you know, that I think is the hardest part for a lot of screenwriters, or maybe something they miss, is creating that empathy. Because when you
very hard.
Yeah, because you know it's always that question. You know, why should I care about these characters? Why am I invested in these characters? The company that probably does this the best is Pixar, with how they create empathy for their characters. And you know, they Wall-E is a robot. He's made to look very sort of, you know, sheepish, and you know, he's not like really a threat. You know, you have the Up, an old man who's lost his wife. I think Up is probably the best movie they've ever done. I think Up was absolutely phenomenal.
People are. I mean, I was sobbing just after the prologue. You know, it's just such a beautiful prologue. It's this love story, and yeah, he just has this gigantic void that he probably believed that at his age will never be filled. And then this boy comes into his life, and then you have, you know, magic is one of the greatest ways to fill the void. There's a wonderful documentary on HBO about Steven Spielberg's career. It's a retrospective. It's just, the whole thing is just filled with so much great, you know, insight, and you get to hear Spielberg tell stories about things that, you know, some of his greatest achievements were accidental, you know, like Jaws. To me, the best thing about Jaws is that you never see the shark, or you almost never see the shark, but the tension of the shark being there is even greater than seeing the shark. But that was not by design. That was because they couldn't get the mechanical shark to actually work, and it didn't look good, so they had to hide it. And then they said, well, how do we create the tension of the shark if we can't show the shark? Which they just couldn't. If just physically, the production wasn't up to, you know, we didn't have the technology to do that in a convincing way back then. So it's like, well, what if there's music that, you know, stands for the shark? And when we hear the music, we'll be scared. And, you know, again, those are the strongest things in that movie, which was it was done to solve a problem, and it actually makes the movie even more brilliant. But in terms of the voids, in that documentary, Spielberg talks about how E.T. did not begin as a story of a boy who meets an extraterrestrial. E.T. was really Spielberg's desire to tell a story about how divorce impacts a child, because his parents divorced when he was a kid, and the void was so enormous when his parents split up. So the question for him was, I want to tell a story about how that enormous void created by divorce impacts a child. And then he started to think, what could possibly fill that void? Because it's so infinite, especially for a kid, you know. And then he came up with the idea, well, what if he discovers an alien from another planet and they form a friendship? And both of them have the same goal, which is to go home, but in different ways. You know, the child of divorce wants home to be the way it was, and for the parents to get back together. And for Elliot, it's about getting back to his planet. And I just thought that to me just speaks to the emotional core of a movie. It may come from the beginning, and first then you have to figure out how to fill it, and maybe that gives you your story. Or maybe you have the idea of a boy encounters an extraterrestrial. And then you still always have to go back and ask, what's the emotional core of the story? What's the emotional void? How, you know, just even when you're pitching a TV show, I was just talking about this in class last week. I said, everybody who's pitching, you need, you know, I tell my students, find a way to pitch your story in 10 minutes. It's like a comedian, you need a tight 10. That's the key to success for a stand-up comic, right? You need a tight 10 minutes, and it needs to pretty much be filled with material that you just know kills, right? And then you go on the road and you keep doing your tight 10 and you build. A tight 10-minute pitch. But I said, let's just have a rule that at least 3 times during those 10 minutes, you have to stop and say to whoever you're pitching to, now, let's talk about how the character's feeling now at this point in the story, And I said, and use really strong words like, devastated, enraged, betrayed, desperate, strong words to convey how they're feeling, because no matter how good the plot is and no matter how good the idea is, a pitch is only as good as the emotional connection that reels in the audience. They have to invest in the characters. And I think that's probably, even though most people intellectually know that's important, I think people often underestimate the power of emotion in a story. And it's because it's the toughest thing to write and it's the toughest thing to convey. A lot of people just try, well, they don't try, but they'll almost inadvertently stick to the surface and the plot details instead of going deeper into story. Roger Ebert, the late film critic, said, we're not in the entertainment business. We're in the empathy business. And to me, empathy is everything in a story. And it's often the thing that's most easily overlooked by the creator. So if anybody gets anything out of this, at least from my perspective, look at the role of empathy in your story. And if there isn't a clear emotional journey, you've still got a lot of work to do. You're missing a whole layer. And it applies equally to comedy. If you look at a movie like Bridesmaids and Annie's emotional journey, it's all about feeling abandoned in a friendship and feeling like you're never going to be worthy of love. And those are universal thematics, but they're also emotional, and people can relate to them. And it's what makes the movie, the screenplay was nominated for an Oscar. It's what took it from, what either a long SNL sketch or what could have been one joke that turned it into a movie that had a huge laughs and great characters, but also a lot of heart.
Yeah, it's kind of like what I always feel too is when you're outlining a story, you get an idea and you start kind of outlining it. You kind of put the cart before the horse because you start saying, what could happen, these plot twists, these turns, blah, blah, blah. And then characters kind of thought of afterwards, like, a character can be plugged into this when it should be reversed. Right. It should be a character in this. And what kind of character is it? How am I going to create this sort of empathy between everything? Yeah. And a great movie that I always go back to is Blood Simple. That just has great characters and just the twists and turns of what they're doing to try to, it's almost out of love, I think it's the only Coen Brothers movie, by the way, that isn't about money. I know you mentioned about a lot of movies are about coming of age, and I actually just and I actually just saw this this video recently about this analysis of the Coen Brothers movie and how all their movies are about money and the pursuit of money. And I watched a little bit more and I was like, wow, that really is true. But I don't think Blood Simple is about money. I think it's more of about, I guess it is about money in a way, but Raising Arizona was the other exception. But that again was the baby was about money because, that whole thing about kidnapping the kid and then there was a bounty hunter who came back. So, but and then some of the characters got greedy about that reward money. But yeah, I just think that character, sometimes is not really thought of. And with TV, it's all about character. It's whether it's the TV show Ozarks. Somebody once told me we're in the golden age of TV, which is true, but it's also much more segregated now because now you got YouTube and Vudu and HBO and Showtime and all these other things where you have all these great TV shows and they're on like 100 different channels.
Yeah, there are actually going to be over 500 scripted shows across platforms this year. That's, and tens and tens of billions developed on acquisition, production, and some, I'm finding that a lot of the top streaming platforms like Netflix and Hulu and premium cable channels like HBO, HBO and Showtime still develop, but Netflix doesn't spend a lot on development. They like people to come to them with projects that are what they would, Ted Sarandos, who runs Netflix chief of content, he says they're never going to buy a project that's half-baked. They're looking for, and this is pretty much across the board now, and this is a big change from just even a few years ago, which is it's very rare anybody's just going to buy a pilot. They're going to want to read a pilot. They're going to want to read a series Bible or even just a mini Bible so they know that it can sustain over at least one season. They would want more detail about season one and then a suggestion of where it might go in future seasons. There are platforms that want you to map out multiple seasons. A friend of mine does a great criminally underappreciated kind of a sleeper series for Amazon called Patriot. I don't know if you've seen it. Very few people have seen it. Stephen Conrad, who is best known probably for writing the movie The Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith, but he also wrote The Weatherman with Nicolas Cage and The Secret Life of Walter Mitty with Ben Stiller. And he's a really wonderful movie writer. But he created a series for Amazon called Patriot, and I think almost nobody saw it. It's great. It's a very dark comedy. It did get picked up for season 2, so they're in production now. God, what was your question again? I started to get on Patriot as an example, and now I'm blanking on why I was going there.
We were just talking about character.
Yes. So Morgan Wendell, at the time, who had developed Lost when he was at ABC as a drama executive, he had gone over to Amazon to run drama. And because of the Lost experience where, the series kind of didn't bear a lot of resemblance to what they originally imagined. And some of that was just the show became so successful that they had to stretch the story out over more seasons than they had intended. But because Morgan Wendell was involved with Lost, when Stephen Conrad came in to sell Patriot, and Stephen had not done television, they really, in order for him to have made that deal, they really needed proof of concept, and they wanted him to map out how it could sustain over many seasons, not just over the first season. And Stephen had to prove all of that to them. And, now everybody wants that. Everybody wants proof of concept, maybe a pilot episode and a second episode already written. Another trend is networks and studios are now soft greenlighting shows where they'll first greenlight the writer's room, and they'll see how many scripts can come out that are of the same high quality as the pilot that excited them. So before they commit to production, they want many scripts, and they want to see that the writer's room has come up with a very strong plan for the season. That's another trend that's happening. And of course, most of these series Bibles or mini Bibles that are part of the selling process are just selling tools. As soon as the writer's room assembles, often everything in the Bible goes out the window because they come up with better ideas. But, so you need the Bible, you need to have the plan and be able to articulate it to satisfy the person who's investing, millions of dollars ultimately in a production. And then a lot of that, gets thrown out as you make discoveries and find your way, and the characters sort of take a life of their own, and casting is a huge part of this. A lot of times on paper, it didn't seem like two characters would need to spend a lot of time together, but then you realize that when they're on screen, the chemistry is so strong that sometimes shows like Homeland decide they're going to accelerate the romance, like between Carrie and Brody in season 1. That wasn't supposed to happen until much later. Or in, back to Breaking Bad, Jesse Pinkman was supposed to be killed off, halfway through season 1. But once they saw the chemistry between Aaron Paul oh my God, Bryan Cranston, suddenly that they were like, oh, this is the central relationship. This is like the strongest part of the show. This is the sweet spot of the show. Let's not kill off Jesse Pinkman. This gives us more story. So a lot of what's happening now is you need a plan and you need a vision. You need to articulate it up front to convince buyers that you actually have proof of concept, some kind of a package, maybe even a director or a showrunner attached, maybe an actor who's interested, so that, like when Netflix notoriously greenlit 2 full seasons of House of Cards, some of it was based on algorithms, but more of it was based on the package of, David Fincher and Beau Willimon, and at the time, Kevin Spacey, which of course now would be the kiss of death. But, they're betting on a winning racehorse. And the more that you can convince them up front that they have a winning horse, the more likely they're going to be to write those checks and to give you the green light.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what everyone sort of, again, like with just tying it back, almost like a TV show, almost tying it back to what we were initially talking about, which was creating that script and that's your sort of, it's your calling card, that's your ability to say, this is what I'm capable of. It's outside the box thinking. And I mean, just to take another side note, I know, I want to also, just before we close, I know we're running out of time. I want to talk about your new book, but I just to sort of put a final thought on all this. I have whenever I see these superhero movies that come out, we always talk about the ending has to be closed, and you know what I mean? But like, it's always like, I always go in there and I go, gee, I wonder what they're going to set up next. I wonder what series they're going to set up next.
Yeah,
and I'm always like, so I already know that, hey, this guy's not going to be beat. They're just going to say, oh yeah, we invented the Johnson ray that resurrected him. And it's like, come on, guys. I mean, it's just like, it's so pedantic and it's so insulting to the audience to just, I get it. I honestly get it. But it's now to the point where it's like, no matter what happens, there's always a way someone's resurrected, and I'm just like, I don't know. Maybe I'm just too burnt out with this. I know how comic books work, and I know comic books are a lot like novels where they allow all these different imaginations and things that happen. Because in comics they have like alternate worlds, or that was a alternate universe, or maybe hey that was someone's dream, or hey this was blah 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 blah. But
right.
But
Those are
like
tropes now.
Yeah, exactly. How the comic books, how they were able to just explain something away by saying, hey, that was a dream. That was a psychotic episode. That was a this or that. But, with movies, I think it just ends up being like, it's a little like, okay, I just saw Thor Ragnarok the other day. It just came out on Blu-ray. And I thought it was actually hilarious. Which is what they needed, because a lot of these movies are too brooding for me, where everyone tries to be sort of, you know what I mean? Like tries to be either cool or brooding, but that movie was just funny. And, I know I had a friend of mine who saw it with me who said he didn't like it because it was too funny. But I said, I think you need that. But even at the end of Thor, there's this stinger where they're setting up, where another ship comes upon them and you're kind of like, well, now who's this? And maybe it's, who's that villain? Not Darkseid. Maybe it is Darkseid. I don't remember. But yeah, it's one of those villains that I don't know. There's like 10,000 of them. I saw Justice League, and I said I think I'm done with DC movies. But I mean,
the exceptions though. I mean, Christopher Nolan, really reinvented the superhero movie with the, Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, and by connecting to their humanity and their flaws. So even though, The Dark Knight ends in a way that is very unexpected, where Batman makes this big sacrifice for the greater good. And I mean, superheroes do tend to do those kinds of things, but this was where you were actually ending the movie with him not a hero, but where everybody's going to think that he's actually the villain in a way. And Deadpool or Guardians of the Galaxy, having the humor and kind of turning the typical superhero movie on its ear. Black Panther, I thought, was just great, with really strong female characters who were more badass than any of the male characters. I like that the formulas are being twisted and reinvented in some cases, I think the big studios, that are primarily in the big event tentpole movie franchise business, in some cases they can get lazy if they want to, because you have a whole new generation who isn't aware that things that you and I might think are tropes or that we're burnt out on, for them these are brand new, and they're thinking it's exciting. So for them, they're still able to squeeze new life out of what might be an older genre, but movies that are designed to be franchises are more like TV pilots, because they're not designed to end. They're designed to be the beginning of a conversation and a relationship with the audience. I love the first Iron Man, because the formula of all superhero movies is, or almost all of them, is that the person has a dual identity and that nobody seems to know. It's that willing suspension of disbelief that nobody's going to realize that Bruce Wayne is Batman, just because his voice is a little different and he's not wearing the mask. Nobody figures that out. What I loved about Iron Man is at the very end of the first movie, he says, well, the truth is, I am Iron Man. And he outs himself. Loved that ending. I thought they just went exactly against what every other superhero movie does. And it was surprising, and it was funny. And then they still were able to set themselves up for multiple franchises, but just in a different way. So I think writers have to work harder to innovate and twist, put a spin on an old formula, because we're never really going to come up with something 100% fresh at this point, and it's very difficult to come up with something that nobody's ever done. But can you put a fresh spin on it, that's very unique to the voice of the writer? And I think that's what's exciting most to audiences now. And certainly it's the most satisfying experience for me when that's done.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And Iron Man 1 was fantastic, and it just completely changed that sort of template that they were going by, and
I love it.
Yeah, it was awesome, and I also enjoyed Iron Man 3, but then again, it was Shane Black, so I was a little biased, but and just actually, I know we're starting to run out of time here, Neil, but just to sort of finish off, I want to talk about your book really quickly.
Sure.
TV writing again is the biggest thing right now. I think you have to have a pilot of some kind in your portfolio if you're going to be a writer.
Yeah.
And not only in Hollywood, but even in like a YouTube episodic series. You know what I mean? So what was some of the impetus for you to creating this in creating the book, TV Writing on Demand?
Well, this is my 5th book, and my last 3 books have all been about television. So I did a book called The TV Showrunner's Roadmap, which primarily covered broadcast TV, and I wanted to have a lot of interviews with showrunners in there as well to get lots of different perspectives. So I interviewed, for that book, I talked to Shonda Rhimes and Vince Gilligan and David Shore, and, just to kind of talk about their creative process. And then the other half of those books was me and what I teach at UCLA in the MFA screenwriting program, because I run the TV side of the program. And I've had a lot of students who have found success. And so I wanted to just kind of write a book that talked about the nuts and bolts of how to write a pilot and how to put a series together, whether it be a drama, 1 hour or a half-hour comedy. After that, but when I finished that book, there was so much new TV coming, so many shows like, Mr. Robot and House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. And I decided, there's so much more to say now. And I was lying in bed having trouble sleeping, and I came up with the title TV Outside the Box, which was basically going to talk about where TV's going. And I got up and I Googled it, and it didn't exist as a title. And I thought, okay, this is going to be the new book. And I'm going to write about the trailblazers in what I thought was the new platinum age of television. But as I researched the book, I realized it was a TV revolution. Like what happened to the music business is happening to the TV business, where it's just completely changing everything about it, how we consume it, how it's distributed. And then now, so that then took me to the new book, TV Writing on Demand, which is, if it's being distributed differently and made differently and doesn't have to be written with commercial breaks and act outs and doesn't have to be programmed into time slots where the audience is, where the network might be afraid if they miss a few episodes, they'll never catch up because nobody misses episodes anymore. We have the ability to watch things whenever we want and in any order we want. So then I just thought, well, I want to write a book that's kind of a companion to TV Outside the Box that talks about how the content's being created differently because of this revolution that we're in the TV business. And so the new book talks about, Atlanta and The Crown and Westworld and the new Fargo and Stranger Things and Insecure and Ozark and The Night Of and, American Gods, and basically the next iteration of great television and why these shows are great and how they're being created differently because of how the consumer interacts with them. So, for example, instead of Law and Order, one of the most stalwart, successful TV shows ever, where there was a murder, an investigation, a trial, and a verdict all in 42 minutes with commercials. Now we have the season-long procedural where it's one murder over the course of the whole season. There were people who tried to do that in the past, but now that's just kind of like everything is slow burn. Big Little Lies and Handmaid's Tale and, everything is serialized and everything is a slow burn, and the audience really appreciates that. So the new book basically is more for content creators and writers, but there's also analysis of a lot of these great shows that are very hot right now, and what makes them work and how they kind of fit into the new TV landscape. So if people who read the book, they'll see there's chapters on dystopias and magic realism and portals and dramedies that don't have to be comedy or drama, and just kind of how everything's shifting and moving away from formula and moving toward slow burn, serialized content that takes us places we're not expecting because there's the time to go deeper and to explore arcs over time.
And everybody, I am with Focal Press. We're actually going to give away a copy of this book, which is TV Writing on Demand by Neil. We're actually going to give away a copy for free. So if you want to retweet, by the way, so here's how it's going to work. If you want to retweet not only the episode, but also comment what you've learned during listening to this episode, you will get a free copy of the book. If you're inside the U.S., you will get a choice between a PDF or a hard copy of the book. If you're outside the U.S., you can still participate, but I can only, if you win, I can only give you a PDF. So I will link to Neil's book in the show notes. So again, just to enter, you have to retweet the episode and also mention what you've learned from listening to this episode between Neil and I as we've gone through all about writing and everything else. And it's a really great book, by the way. I'm going to link to that in the show notes, everybody. It's TV Writing on Demand. And Neil, I've just been going through all the different chapters you have here, just about all the different things that are going on in the TV and all the examples and stuff like that. And I'm starting to realize, there's so many different TV shows. You start to remember, like, Jesus, all these TV shows are happening at the same exact time. It's unbelievable.
It is, and the question I get the most is, how do you possibly keep up with all of this content? And the answer is, it's really hard. I stay up very late, and I read a lot of scripts, and I watch a lot of TV, because this is my area this is what I specialize in now, and I've always loved television. I've always escaped into television just from the time I was a kid, and I've never seen a better time. I mean, this is just the most exciting time in television, both for viewers and if you're a content creator, a writer. There's never been a better time to break into television. There's a huge demand, and it's still cutthroat and extremely competitive, but there is opportunity, and people need to fill, there's just a big appetite right now. So I encourage people to write stuff that's authentic, that only they can write. And probably the last thing I can leave you with is, if you're going to create a pilot for a show or a screenplay, the three most important questions to ask yourself are, why this idea, why you as the writer, and why now for this project? If you don't have good, compelling answers to those questions, I think you need to dig deeper into your creative process and what you want your work to represent about you, deeper. Because just writing a story that you're not connected to, that you think might sell, isn't enough anymore. It has to go deeper, and there is the personal story, or the story that's rooted in authenticity, is what everybody's looking for.
And Neil, I think that's a great way to sort of put a period in this whole conversation. So Neil, where can people find you at? Where can people find you at online?
Either neillandau.com, Facebook, or UCLA. But neillandau.com will give a contact information.
And I will link to all that in the show notes, everybody, including, again, the contest details in case you just want to review them. But they're very easy. Just retweet and then just comment about what you've learned listening to this episode. Everyone, it's davebullis.com. Twitter, it's at DBPodcast. Or if you want to go to my personal one, it's just at Dave_Bullis. Neil Landau, I want to say thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And have a good weekend to you and all your listeners.
Find Dave at davebullis.com. Please make sure to subscribe and share the podcast.